80 years ago, in early 1945, 15-year-old Anne Frank died from a typhus epidemic in the Nazi German-based concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. As the 7,500-foot replica of the Otto Frank family secret annex in Amsterdam opens in New York City, writer Ruth Franklin is publishing her new biography called The Many Lives of Anne Frank. According to Ruth Franklin, the title of the book refers to the multiplicity of ways in which Anne has been understood and misunderstood. Anne Frank's diary is one of the best-selling nonfiction books of all time, reportedly over 30 million copies. Ruth Franklin, when did you get interested in Anne Frank?
Well, I've been interested in Anne Frank really ever since I was a girl, and I first read the diary when I was 8 or 9 years old. But I got interested in her, more professionally as I started to notice over the last couple of decades, we would occasionally hear in the news that missing pages from the diary or other different versions of it were newly available. And so I started really asking questions about, about the publication history of the diary and how we were able to understand Anne's intentions in writing it, which maybe weren't exactly the way they had traditionally been presented.
Where do you live right now?
I'm in Brooklyn.
And how often have you visited the annex in Amsterdam?
Well, I visited only twice, actually. I visited once as a child, and then I wrote most of my book during COVID. So I wasn't able to visit until really the very end of my research process when I did get to make a trip.
What year did the family go to the annex and why?
They entered the annex in early July 1942. This was this time, this was about a couple of years, 2 years, just over 2 years after the Nazis had occupied the Netherlands, where Anne's family was living at the time. They were German refugees from Frankfurt. They entered the annex because Anne's sister received what's called a call-up notice, a notice summoning her to report for what were then called labor duty in Germany. Of course, now we know that this was code for deportation to Auschwitz. But the Jews in Amsterdam didn't know that at the time. Even so, Otto Frank, Anne's father, had been making plans to take the family into hiding at that point for about a year. It was at that point starting to become common knowledge that these sorts of roundups of Jews, these mass deportations, might start to happen soon. And so he had already been making arrangements for the family to hide in the back portion, sort of the back half of his office building, which is the area we now know as the annex. Secret annex is a little bit of a mistranslation from the Dutch, but it does sound more romantic that way, and probably would have liked that term. So they have been thinking about it for a while, but the impetus to go into hiding was this call-up notice that Margot Frank received in early July 1942, and that was actually in the very first round of call-ups of young Jews.
How old was Anne Frank then?
She was 13. She had just turned 13, and of course she received the diary as a present for her 13th birthday, only a few weeks before the family went into hiding.
You talked about the fact that she's written a number of novels. Did she write those before the annex or during the annex?
Well, she wrote a lot of fiction while she was in the annex. There's only one book that we could call a novel. It's an unfinished novel, sort of a romance. She loved to write fiction. It's not clear to me, actually, if she wrote fiction before going into hiding. If she did, I don't believe any of it has survived. But while she was in hiding, along with the diary, she wrote fables, fairy tales, and other kind of fantastic fiction.
What was the date they actually went to the annex?
I'm almost 100% sure that it's July 5th, 1944. But that may be the date of the call-up notice. It could be July 6th. I would have to check. It's either July 5th or July 6th, 1944.
44 or 42?
Oh, sorry, 42, of course, 42.
Who went there with them?
Initially, they went by themselves. They were supported by some of Otto's employees. Otto Frank, as I said, they were in hiding in the office building where he was had the headquarters of his company, and he was very close friends with a number of the employees who then asked if they would be willing to help sustain the family in hiding. This is something that was absolutely crucial to survival, and it's why, in fact, many Dutch Jews didn't survive being in hiding. Or weren't able to go into hiding in the first place because they needed a network of non-Jewish friends to live on the outside and to be able to have access to ration cards with which to supply them with food and other necessities. So they went into hiding by themselves, but I'm reluctant to say that because they were supported by these friends who visited every single day and brought supplies. They were joined by another family, another German Jewish family, the Van Pelses, about a week later. This was another family of German Jews who were refugees in the Netherlands, two parents and their son, who was about around 3 years older than Anne. And then a few months later, in November 1942, they were joined by a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer, who was another Jew on the outside who was looking for a hiding place. And they decided that they were able to squeeze a little bit extra and take him in.
How many different rooms were there in the annex, and how did you get there once you got to that building?
So, as I said, the annex was toward the back of Otto Frank's office building. The way you got there, you entered the building on the first floor, which was a warehouse, and there were employees in the warehouse who, throughout the period that the annex residents were in hiding, never knew that they were there. Their location, the hiding place's location, was kept secret from all of these employees simply because it wasn't known whether they were trustworthy enough. So you entered the building through the warehouse, and then you would go up one flight of stairs. That was the office level where all the office employees worked, and they were the ones who were in on the secret. And then from that level, you go towards the back, and there was a door that covered up a staircase. And that staircase, it's a very, very steep, narrow staircase, leads up one flight to the first floor of the annex. And on that level, I believe there were two rooms, a large room that initially the Frank parents lived in, and then a smaller bedroom that initially Anne and Margot shared. And then when the dentist arrived, he and Anne would share that room, and Margot moved in with her parents. And there's also a bathroom on that level. And then up another level was a large kitchen and sort of living area that the Van Pelses used as their bedroom at night. And then a much, much smaller room for Peter Van Pels. And then finally, above that, there was an attic level. So as I said, you accessed it via this staircase. After just a few weeks or so in hiding, I think the residents felt that the door leading to the staircase was a little bit too vulnerable. And so the father of one of the office employees, who was also a close friend of Otto's, made a bookcase that would stand in front of the doorway, and he invented a hinge mechanism that the helpers could use on the outside to open the bookcase and access the annex. When nobody was visiting, the bookcase was flush against the wall, and it looked like any other bookcase.
Jump to the end just for a moment. When did that family end up leaving the annex, and where did they go?
So the annex was raided on August 4th, 1944. And to this day, it's not known what triggered that raid. There are many different theories. It's possible that the Gestapo was tipped off that there were Jews hiding in the annex and came to investigate. It's possible that they just were looking for stolen goods and found the Jews living there by accident. That's actually a theory that some researchers at the Anne Frank House have supported. But for whatever reason, at around 10:30 in the morning, a police car with Gestapo agents and Dutch police pulled up at the building, and they came in. They asked where the Jews were hiding. They accessed the annex, and they arrested everybody living there, as well as a couple of the office employees for helping them. And initially, they were all taken to prison in Amsterdam. And then within a few days, all the Jews were deported to Westerbork, which was a Dutch transit camp, kind of a large holding pen for Jews from the Netherlands before their transport to mostly to death camps in the east, mostly to Auschwitz, also some to Sobibor and to Regensstadt, as well as Bergen-Belsen. And that's where Anne and her family and the other residents wound up about a month later. They were all deported to Auschwitz on what was actually the very last transport to leave from Westerbork to that camp.
How big is Auschwitz? And I know there was an Auschwitz 1, 2, and 3. And what did they do there? What did Anne and the family do there?
Well, it's hard to say with precision what exactly they did there because we don't have direct testimony from anyone other than Otto Frank, who, of course, was the only resident of the annex to survive and return to tell his story. Auschwitz is a huge camp. Around 1.5 million Jews were ultimately murdered there. As you say, there were several parts. Auschwitz I was a labor camp, mainly labor camp. Auschwitz II, which is also known as Birkenau, was the women's camp and also the extermination portion of the camp. That's where the gas chambers and the crematoria were. So women who were prisoners in the camp, including obviously Anne, her mother, her sister, Mrs. Van Pels, lived day to day with the knowledge of what was going on in those gas chambers and crematoria. It simply couldn't be avoided. It was right in front of them. And Auschwitz III, which is better known from the works of Primo Levi, who was an employee in a factory there, was a kind of a cluster of satellite camps run by various German companies, including IG Farben, who used the labor of the Jews there as slave labor for the war effort and for their own manufacturing. But so Anne and her sister and her mother, together with Mrs. Van Pels, were all in the part that we know as Auschwitz II. They were there for probably around 6 weeks. Again, we don't have a precise date for their transfer to Bergen-Belsen. And we don't know exactly what happened to them there, but we can assume that they were treated like all other women prisoners, that they were exploited for their labor, they were enslaved, that they were starved. We know from some other Dutch women who survived the camp and saw Anne there that she appeared to be handling the situation about as well as one might expect. We know that she also got sick in the camp and that she and her sister were sent to a barracks for people with scabies, a kind of a skin disease, and that her mother and several other women worked very hard while they were there to get food to them and try to sustain them while they were in this isolated barracks, which was a very dangerous place to be in health-wise, of course. And so they spent about 6 weeks in Auschwitz, and then Anne and her sister Margot were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, and her mother Edith was left behind in Auschwitz, where she would eventually die a couple months later.
When they would now Bergen-Belsen's in Germany, Auschwitz is in Poland.
That's right.
When they transferred them, how did they get them to their next location?
They went by train.
And how long was the trip from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen?
It was days, probably 4 or 5 days. It was a miserable trip in freezing cold Northern Europe late fall weather. But we have a fair amount of testimony from women who were on this transport together with Anne and Margot. They say actually that they were happy to be on this transport because they imagined that wherever they were going, it couldn't possibly be worse than Auschwitz. Unfortunately, of course, this turned out not to be true, and Bergen-Belsen was an extraordinarily torturous camp for everyone there. But at the time, they felt somewhat optimistic that being transported there might mean that their situation was improving.
Was this one of those trains where they would put 75 people in the car, lock it up, and they wouldn't open it up till they got to their destination?
Pretty much. I think they opened it maybe once a day or so to give the women water. I don't believe they were provided with any food. But it was a very, very unpleasant and dangerous, even fatal way to travel.
Back to the annex. Who was the fellow that dumped out the diary onto the floor?
Excuse me. That was SS agent Karl Silberbauer, who is the person who led the raid on the annex. And he was discovered around 20 years later by the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who tracked him down in his home in Austria and actually confronted him as being the person who had conducted the raid on the annex. But, at the time, he was just, a fairly lowly Nazi functionary who was, summoned from his desk and told to go check out what was going on at this particular address. As Otto Frank would later testify, of course, again, he's the only person who survived to witness this encounter. Silberbauer was simply looking for a place to put the few valuables that he was able to take from the annex. And he took the briefcase that Anne used to keep her diary, her diaries, and all her several notebooks, and as well as the loose pages on which she wrote her revised version. And he just dumped it all on the floor.
How did Otto Frank survive?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's hard to say with any certainty why one person survived Auschwitz and another didn't. I think it was luck. It was having a strong constitution. Otto was actually in the infirmary at Auschwitz when the camp was liquidated in early January 1945. As the Red Army was approaching, the Nazis decided to empty out the camp and march all of the residents who were able to walk on what's now become known as a death march towards camps west, towards the interior of Germany. And at Peter van Pels, who was very close to Otto in Auschwitz, again, this is the son of the other family who were in hiding with them, who would, as is well known, would eventually become Anne's boyfriend. After seeing his own father murdered in Auschwitz, Peter and Otto became very, very close. And they had a conversation that Otto later remembered, where Otto prevailed upon Peter to not to go on this march and to stay and hide in the infirmary with him. And Peter refused to do it. We don't know why. He was young and strong, and he probably thought that he would survive the march. He didn't. Sadly, he wound up dying in Mauthausen. And his death is actually recorded as being on the very day that the war ended. But Otto stayed in the infirmary, which turned out to be a relatively safe choice. The Nazis left the camp, and the prisoners were left on their own for, I think, as much as a couple of weeks until the Red Army came and liberated them.
How long did Otto live?
Otto lived, I believe, until age 89 or 90.
1980.
1980. So he was 91.
How many of those camps have you visited?
A couple of them. I visited Auschwitz and Majdanek, which are both in Poland. I visited a smaller camp called Neuengamme in Germany, which is actually where Fritz Pfeffer ended up dying. And of course, many of the Nazis' prisoners were shuffled from camp to camp at various points.
Are you Jewish?
Yes, I am.
What impact as a Jew did this have on you?
Sorry, I have to think about that one for a moment. As a Jew, I've always felt very strongly that it's the imperative of younger generations to tell the stories of what happened during the Holocaust. I was raised in a family of survivors and refugees and brought up hearing their stories. And it was impressed upon me at a very young age that it is, not only essential never to forget what happened during the Holocaust, but to keep those stories alive and to keep passing them on to younger generations and new readers who are not yet aware of them.
Who in your family survived the Holocaust?
My grandparents survived deportation by Stalin after Hitler's invasion. It's a complicated story that I wrote about a couple of years ago in the New York Review of Books. My grandparents survived Nazi occupation in Poland and then were deported by Stalin to a kind of a prison camp in northern Russia. And my great aunt survived Auschwitz.
What's your background?
My background is as a literary critic. I briefly attended grad school in comparative literature before deciding that I wanted to write about literature for a general audience rather than an academic audience. And I started off at the New Republic as an editor on the books and arts section of that magazine. And I've been writing book reviews and criticism ever since. I started writing biography and cultural journalism, profiles, and that sort of work out of a kind of frustration with the limits of criticism. I often found that I didn't want to simply pass judgment on a book, but I wanted to be able to be in dialogue with the author and ask questions rather than simply stating my opinion. So that's really what attracted me to biography. Obviously, it's not possible to be in dialogue with the dead, but it is a different way, a different approach to a literary text that feels in some ways more comprehensive and more human than criticism can.
One of the most interesting people you write about for me was Meyer Levin or Levin, not sure how you pronounce it.
Levin, yeah.
Who was he?
He was a journalist, a novelist, eventually a playwright who became fascinated by the diary, even obsessed by it. He came upon it in its French translation around 1950 and was so moved by it that he wrote to Otto Frank offering his own work as a kind of ad hoc literary agent to help Otto find a publisher for the diary in America, which initially was quite a struggle. He was rejected by around a dozen publishers in the US and in England before Doubleday picked up the book to do an English translation. So Meyer Levin was devoted to the book from the start. He wrote a review of it that appeared on the cover of the New York Times Book Review that is largely credited with launching the diary as a bestseller in the United States. Of course, it did immediately take off, perhaps in large part to that glowing review in which Meyer Levin, described the book as, and not only as an essential read, but also as an extremely relatable document. I think he was trying to dispel readers' fears that this might be some kind of gloomy work of literature about the Holocaust. And he said, no, this is the diary of a teenage girl who's writing about all kinds of things that anyone can relate to under any circumstances. After the diary became so popular, Otto Frank was convinced that a Broadway adaptation would be the next logical step. He initially hadn't been certain about a play, whereas Meyer Levin was keen on that idea from the start and asked Otto to promise him that he could adapt the play for Broadway. After the book became a bestseller, many, many other people became interested in it. And through complicated machinations that even after doing my own research and reading several books on this subject, I'm still not entirely clear what happened. But Meyer Levin got pushed aside. The adaptation of the diary that he wrote was deemed unproducible, unplayable, and the playwrights Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett were chosen to do the Broadway adaptation. And after that happened, Meyer Levin became absolutely enraged. He ended up suing Otto Frank for breach of contract over this. And he was absolutely convinced that only a Jewish playwright could do justice to the diary. He believed that Goodrich and Hackett, who were talented, and well-regarded Hollywood screenwriters, would inevitably misunderstand or fail to communicate the essential Jewishness of this book. And in fact, many critics of the play have believed that he was right about that, and that the Goodrich and Hackett adaptation does in some ways take away Anne's Jewish essence.
There's a kind of, if you're my age, a present day story about a woman named Barbara Zimmerman who married Jason Epstein, who was Random House, but she, as you all know, started the outfit that you've written some copy for, the New York Review of Books, which was started because of a strike at the New York Times. I'm going on, but tell me how she fit into all this.
She played a crucial role in the publication of the diary in the U.S. And I think it's interesting to notice that two young women, employees of Doubleday, were instrumental in bringing the diary to people's attention when their male bosses were less interested in it. One of them was the editor who became known as Judith Jones. That was her married name. But at the time she was working at Doubleday, then she was Judith Bailey. And she was an assistant in the Paris office when the French translation of the diary came in. Her boss put it in a pile of manuscripts for her to write rejection letters for. And she said something about that book attracted her, maybe the picture of the girl on the cover. And she pulled it out of that pile of rejected manuscripts and couldn't put it down, and told her boss, this one is one we have to send on to New York. And he did so, and later was very happy to take the credit for that. And the other young woman staffer who you mentioned was Barbara Zimmerman, later Barbara Epstein, who was an assistant, a young editor in the Doubleday office in New York, who also felt an immediate and very powerful attraction, both to the book and to Otto Frank himself. She became very close to him and was very supportive of him throughout the publishing process, which was sometimes difficult on him. Doubleday published the book with a marketing budget of literally zero. They were not prepared to spend any money advertising it. And even so, Barbara Zimmerman managed to organize this incredible publicity push that included Meyer Levin's review. She went around to the Doubleday bookstores in Manhattan personally to make sure that the book was there. And she, perhaps even more importantly, she organized an introduction to the book that was signed by Eleanor Roosevelt. But at this point, we know that it was actually written by Barbara Zimmerman herself. So in all these ways, she was really instrumental to that book's success.
I have a copy of, got more than one copy of the diary, but I figured out this time around, before I talk to you, and I'm not sure I'm right, that I have version C.
Yes.
Now, explain version A, B, C, and the critical, combination of all that.
Sure. Well, if you have a copy of the diary that you bought, say, between 1952 and 1995, then you have version C. And that's the version that Otto Frank put together. So just to back up a little bit, we now know since the 1980s, when a forensic analysis was done of the diary, in part because it had been accused of being a forgery by Holocaust deniers, the Dutch Institute for War Documentation did a forensic analysis of the diary and published a huge volume that's known as the critical edition of the diary, a scholarly volume that lays out the three initial versions. So there's version A, which was Anne's rough draft, which she started in the famous little red checkered notebook that, we've perhaps seen images of, and then continued writing in whatever notebooks she could get access to, including at one point her sister's old chemistry exercise book. And then there is version B, which is her own edit. And I'll just explain briefly that in March 1944, Anne heard a minister from the Dutch government in exile speaking on the radio, and he called on ordinary Dutch citizens to save their documents from the war years, their private documents like diaries and letters, for inclusion in a future national archive that they were envisioning. And Anne writes about hearing the speech in her diary and says that all the residents of the annex immediately made a beeline for it. They knew that they had just such a document right there. But it's clear that as she considered this over the next couple of months, she realized that her version A, the rough draft of her diary as she had written it, wasn't really appropriate for inclusion in this future national archive. It was very, very personal. It included, all kinds of material from, what we would today call fan fiction written in the style of her favorite young adult novelist to, mean remarks about her classmates, all kinds of other stuff. But what it didn't include enough of, it's clear, she thought, was information about the persecution of the Jews. And she writes, when she's describing hearing this speech and her thoughts about her diary, she writes, wouldn't it be funny if people in 10 years from now were told about how we Jews lived and what we ate about and talked about here? And then she seems to realize that, what she has isn't enough. And she goes back to the beginning and rewrites her diary from the start on these new pieces of paper. And what she's doing is she's not only taking out some of that early material, which she seems to have thought of, as too personal and, again, not really appropriate. She's taking that up, but she's also writing new entries and adding new information that makes the diary into the kind of testimony that we know it as. So, for instance, there's an early entry in which she talks about going to an ice cream parlor with her friends. She writes about that in version A, and it's all about, the boys that she's excited to meet there and all that kind of stuff. In version B, she tells the story, but she puts in the detail that the reason they're going to this ice cream parlor is that it's one of the only ones where Jews are allowed to go. And so throughout, she's adding these little details that help give the reader a sense of the larger reality of what was going on for her. And it's important, I think, to realize that she's doing all that, good almost 2 years after beginning the diary as a 13-year-old. So, as a 15-year-old in spring 1944, she's already been in hiding for almost 2 years. She now has a much greater understanding, almost a kind of, almost a historical perspective, but certainly more perspective on what had happened to her all that time. And the finished diary, as we know it, reflects this greater maturity and perception.
Her sister, and you pronounce it Margot?
Margot, yeah, but
Margot.
I say it the American way because I'm American.
Her
But yes,
sister
in German it's Margot.
and Anne died how?
They died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen. It was at that camp was eventually, by the time they got there in fall 1944, the Nazis were using it as a kind of dumping ground for Jews that they were evacuating from camps further east, closer to the front line, as the Russian army, the Soviet army, was pushing forward into the territory. The Nazis were starting to evacuate camps like Auschwitz and others in eastern Poland. And they did this by just dumping a tremendous number of Jews at Bergen-Belsen. It was a camp intended for several thousand people that eventually swelled to hold tens and tens of thousands. There were, in different parts of the camp, there were people in different categories. But when Anne got there weren't even any barracks to hold the prisoners who had been transferred, and they were housed in tents that some of the survivors described as even like circus tents that actually blew down in a rainstorm. So, I say that they died of typhus, which is technically true, but they died of starvation. They died of poor hygiene, in this massive overcrowding. They died of neglect. There were no facilities, very, very little in the way of infrastructure in this camp. There was one latrine that was meant to serve more than 1,000 women. By winter 1944 to 1945, almost no food was being provided in this camp. It was so these women who were leaving Auschwitz initially thinking that they might be going to a better place were almost immediately, just terrorized by these hideous situation that was much worse than what they had experienced before.
You write in your book on page 112, something's holding me back here. It's one of Anne's elves, that is to say, my conscience. Didn't I promise to ride alongside her rather than over her? When I look up from my desk, she's watching me from the sofa across the room, her legs curled up under her. How could you? I hear her say. You know I didn't want to publish all that. Explain.
So I will say that is the only place in the book where I imagine myself in dialogue with Anne. It's something that, as a biographer, I generally don't do. There aren't any invented scenes in this book. There's no made-up dialogue. Everything that's in there is based on the historical record and documentation, except for that one moment in which I did want to sort of give light to my own guilty conscience as a biographer. And I think all biographers suffer from this to a certain point. Nobody asked us to come through and rummage through the personal details of the lives of the people we're writing about. There is, even when done in the most conscientious and thoughtful way, there is just inevitably something that feels invasive about it. And the invasion, the betrayal that I'm referring to in that moment is that I just spoke a little bit about the kinds of edits that Anne made to her version A, her rough draft, in terms of making it into a testimony. But I think one of the most important edits that she made, again, with this testimonial impulse, taking it away from the personal, was that she removed almost the entirety of her romance with Peter, which, if you've read the published version of the diary, I think that's something that lingers so strongly in readers' memories. We remember the very, very sweet teenage romance that brightens up the gloom of the annex. Even under these circumstances, these two kids managed to find each other. Anne didn't want us to be reading about that. She took out, from her revised version, she took out almost every reference to Peter and her feelings for him. And Otto, when he went over the diary again, he looked at all of her rough drafts together with this version B, with the edit that she had made. And in very few cases, he made further cuts. He took out, for instance, a very, very small amount of Anne's criticism of her mother. But he also put back in this, many, many, many entries in which Anne describes her feelings for Peter. And writing this book, I couldn't avoid discussing this. In writing this book, I mostly used the version A of Anne's diary, while incorporating from version B as necessary. When it was possible, I tried to stay with Anne's original version to be as close as possible to her voice without mediation. And I made this choice with the knowledge that, version A has been public knowledge now for almost 40 years. And so I'm not the person who is betraying Anne's desires for what her diary would eventually look like and what the world would know about her secrets. But I couldn't avoid the feeling that, in fact, I was, in some small way, betraying her secret.
So if somebody says, I want to get into this story, what's the best version to buy? I mean, the big version costs a lot of money.
The big version does cost a lot of money and isn't really readily accessible. You can find it in, a university library. The most popular version now is confusingly what sometimes is referred to as version D. It's also called the definitive edition. It is a new version that was published in 1995 by the Anne Frank Foundation that incorporates some additional material from Anne's version A to essentially kind of to fill out and add more to the somewhat pared down version C that you and I both remember reading. That's the version that I grew up reading. But right now, version D, this definitive edition, is the one that's most readily available. And readers who are interested in, the line by line comparison of the different versions can find that also in a relatively new volume called Anne Frank, The Collected Works, which is a little less expensive than that original critical edition and a little more accessible.
98-year-old Cynthia Osick. You quote her in the beginning of the book, and I'm going to try to read this, that the novelist Cynthia Osick writes that Anne Frank's story has been bowdlerized, distorted, transmuted, traduced, reduced. It has been infantilized, Americanized, homogenized, sentimentalized, falsified, kitchified, and in fact blatantly and arrogantly denied. Why did you use that?
Well, Cynthia Ozick doesn't mince words. That quote is from a now famous essay she published in the New Yorker in the 90s called Who Owns Anne Frank? And it's a very, very angry essay about the ways in which Ozick sees Anne's Jewish legacy being neglected. Is a gentle way of saying all the adjectives that you just quoted. She believes that the Broadway adaptation, especially, and the movie that was then made from it, these were both engines of Anne's extraordinary popularity globally. There's no question but that they had an enormous impact. And in fact, they do, at least in their original version. Of course, now there's a new version of the Broadway play as well. But the original Broadway play and the movie do indeed downplay Anne's Jewish identity. There's especially one somewhat notorious passage that Ozick singles out for criticism, in which Anne in the diary is talking to Peter about prejudice and anti-Semitism. And she says, Jews throughout history have always had to suffer. And in the play, this gets turned into a much different statement in which Anne says to Peter, all throughout history, all peoples have had to suffer, sometimes one people, sometimes another. And critics like Ozick, but especially her, have seen this as a real betrayal of Anne's legacy as a Jewish writer, and have argued that the play is a betrayal of her identity in this way. My own take is that the situation is a little bit more complicated than that. Obviously, Anne was persecuted by the Nazis for being a Jew. There is no getting around that question. And of course, I feel strongly that she should be remembered as a Jewish victim of the Holocaust. But to say that the play de-Judaizes her, I think is somewhat of a flattening out of the complications of who she was as the daughter of very, very assimilated German Jews who, were not traditionally, her father especially was not traditionally religious, her mother a bit more so. They did not practice traditional Judaism. They were not observant in the home. And though Anne talks about God quite a bit in her diary, it is more of a kind of pantheistic, almost Judeo-Christian vision of God, and not really a specifically Jewish type of observance. So my own feeling about it is that many people have also, in their zeal to correct for the problems with the Broadway play, have kind of gone too far in the other direction. And that includes Meyer Levin, who we talked about a bit earlier. His own version of the play incorporates quotations from the Jewish prayer book, all kinds of traditional songs, for instance, that were popular among Eastern European Jews like Meyer Levin, but that Western German Jews like the Franks would not have known. And I think takes things too far in overemphasizing her identity as a religious Jew, which was non-existent. So in the end, I think there needs to be a kind of a balance between seeing Anne as a figure who is universally identifiable, who does stand, as Otto Frank always said that he wished her to, who stands as a kind of watchdog against all forms of persecution, and one who is specifically Jewish, who we remember her specific historical identity as a Jew who was persecuted by the Nazis.
30 million plus copies of the book has been sold.
Amazing, right? In more than 70 languages.
Who gets the money now?
I believe it's the Anne Frank Foundation that owns the copyright to the diary in all of its forms.
How did you change your attitude, your thoughts, your feelings about Anne Frank from the first time you read the diary until the second time, and then when you wrote the book?
I will say that what changed my thoughts about Anne the most was learning that she had intended to publish the diary. Again, as I explain in the book, the version that we see almost isn't a diary, but more of a memoir in diary form, that she had intended to publish it herself as a document of persecution. I think, when I was a child, this wasn't public knowledge. The diary was generally seen as, as one Dutch novelist has famously called it, as a found object. Anne was this figure who had, this very innocent victim of the Holocaust who had sort of accidentally managed to dash off this document of global significance and, enduring appeal. And I think the reality is much more interesting, and complicated. But by giving Anne her due as a conscious creator of this text, one who claims agency over it and really takes control of her own story by rewriting it in her own terms, imagining this future audience who were going to be very interested to learn what Jews, ate and talked about and did during all their time in hiding. I think that makes her into a much more interesting and even more inspiring figure.
Who abused her? Not personally in the annex, but since her death and since the diary, who's used her in a negative way?
Well, I think abuse is a strong term, but the last chapter of my book, which is called Pawn, deals with her existence in the political world. And I think, what bothers me about some of the ways she's instrumentalized for different political causes is that I think too often we see a kind of easy blanket identification with her, where we say, this is just like what happened to Anne Frank. Or, this figure is the new Anne Frank. Rather than, allowing us to learn from her story for sure, but to look at the nuances, to understand the historical realities that separate her moment from our current events.
If you lived in Amsterdam when the Franks lived there, what did they notice the changes were about how Jews were treated before they got to the annex? What was their life like?
I think starting almost immediately when they emigrated in 1934, Otto Frank, Edith Frank, and the other German Jews of their cohort were on the lookout for not only to understand what was happening to their relatives and other Jews back at home, but to try to understand what might happen in the Netherlands. I think, initially they did see that as a safe haven. They didn't consider, for instance, emigrating to Palestine, although that was a choice made by some Jews at the time. The Franks identified strongly as Western Europeans, and they believed that they would be safe in Europe. And then as the years go on, we see them gathering in groups, these German refugees. New refugees are arriving, constantly from Germany, and the neighborhood in South Amsterdam where the Franks lives becomes a kind of headquarters for them. And the Franks and other families start hosting these regular weekly Sunday get-togethers where families will come together and share information about what's happening back in Germany. What are the options? Is it still possible to emigrate to the United States? We know that Otto Frank tried to do that at one point. How are they going to be able to keep their families safe in the long run?
So if I want to get her novels, where do I find them?
Well, again, she hasn't published novels that have been published as such, but in the book that I mentioned earlier, Anne Frank, The Collected Works, that contains all of her fiction, the short stories that I mentioned, as well as her unfinished novel. And that's also been published in a smaller paperback version. There's one edition of it called Tales from the Secret Annex, and there are other versions of it as well.
What did you think a few years ago when 60 Minutes and the New York Times and the author, Rosemary Sullivan, came out with this? I mean, they made a big deal out of this, that they had found the person who ratted on the Franks. Did you know the people involved in this? And then it disintegrated. What happened?
I didn't know anyone involved in it. I had heard that about what they called the cold case team. That was a team of detectives using AI and other techniques to sort through the historical evidence and try to identify the betrayer. I had heard that this was going on, but I didn't know anything about the findings before the big media blitz that you describe. Immediately Dutch historians jumped all over the conclusions that this team had reached. It seems that they did kind of operate independently, I guess in part because they didn't want to be scooped, but in a way that it seems that they didn't consider some of the historical circumstances that have now led to that book being withdrawn from circulation in both the Netherlands and Germany. And I think its findings have been quite strenuously rebutted by a team of Dutch historians who really question the premises that the cold case team used when coming to their conclusions.
Do you have any idea why it's not published in Europe, but it's published here in the United States now?
I don't know.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Columbia and to Harvard.
And what are the other works that you've written that are available to the public?
I've written a book about a book of literary criticism about Holocaust literature called 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction. And I've also written a biography of the writer Shirley Jackson called Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life.
The book we've been talking about is called The Many Lives of Anne Frank, and our guest has been Ruth Franklin. Thank you, Ruth Franklin, very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.